now. Well, hello.
Hey, Jeff.
Hello, Matt. How are you today?
Oh man, loaded question, but cream rises to the top, and I gotta say, I'm well fed.
You could be worse, that's for sure.
Yeah, I could be up a creek. You never know, but I'm doing well, man. I'm doing well. How about, I didn't wake up. Today happens to be, I'm trying to think of it this way, but I would get too far afield if I tried to explain. I'm trying to think of today as my Sabbath. It's a Monday. It's most people's beginning, but I work in the restaurant industry, so we lock our doors twice from two different angles to keep people out on Mondays, because this is a set apart day where we don't have to serve, cook, be next to the fire, and talk about wine. So this is kind of a glorious day that I'm glad I get to share with you, Jeff.
Well, I appreciate it. Of all the things that you could be doing today, you choose to spend your time, or at least a little sliver of it, connecting with somebody that you've only seen on the internet.
That's true. Well, through Discord, I found your vehicle.
Say that again?
Through the Discord, I found your vehicle.
Oh yeah, that's right. That's right. I'm having to do the car cast again today. Anytime that I schedule a conversation that happens during the day, this is the only viable place that I have to do it from. At least not on a weekend day.
So I don't know in what direction you want to take this or what was on your heart to discuss, but I reached out to you and asked for this conversation because of two main things. One's the umbrella and the other one's the hand holding the umbrella. The umbrella, the broad concept is you take time out of not only your day, but your weeks and your months. And we may be approaching a year now. I don't know how often you write these things down, of you reaching out your hand to people and engaging them in conversation across the internet. And that's a very curious task you've set for yourself. And I find it fascinating as a third person watching, because one could not have done this 200 years ago.
Right.
And in the 80s, nobody did it, even though they had pagers and phones and stuff like this. So I just wonder what this all portends. And you're right in it. You're in that oven, the kiln before the pottery comes out. So I just want to hear your whether or not you're consciously aware of what you're doing, and if you have a project or if you don't, or however you want to speak of that in relation to this dead figure that still speaks to us, C.S. Lewis. He came out of the kiln, and there's still smoke coming up from those pages, apparently, for you, and certainly for me as well. And so this idea of what's in the words, right? What's in the words? Because you're doing something like a biography. Now that was the umbrella. The hand holding up the umbrella is your particular conversation with Job that was released this morning.
Oh yeah.
And when I watched it and listened, I thought, if he tries to escape me, I'm going to grab his little coat or turtleneck, whatever you're wearing, and I'm ring him in, because now or never, if not now, when? You were talking about following the life of Lewis and then consecrating that in your particular church ensconcement. You're reaching out to the hierarchs within your establishment and offering, I'm not going to say a solution to a problem, but an opportunity to annex some kind of conversation group to the regular activities of church. So those two things, and we can make it rain or hail or sunshine, whatever, around those two things.
Well, a little behind the scenes, you and I had a conversation scheduled that we had talked about doing, but we talked about it quite some time ago, and I never sent out an invite or put anything on the calendar, and then we weren't able to link up yesterday, and that fortuitously led to an impromptu conversation with Job. So that's what got posted today. To answer part of the umbrella part of your question, if there is a word, and I'm sure there is somewhere in the English language, that means anything like unintentional is not strong enough for how I exist. I have a very unintentional way of being. So it seems like none of this has been at least consciously intended. There likely are intentions brewing underneath that I've never really plumbed the depths of myself to figure out, what they are, where they come from, if I can even identify them. Sometimes, a lot of times things just seem to come to be. And if people ask me, well, what made you think of that, or how is that happening? I have a hard time just tracing it back or figuring out what it was. So, I mean, being asked to talk about it, I'm sure helps me a little bit figure out what's going on. And so what I would say is inviting people into conversations, or just producing a platform for people who maybe don't have a platform already to submit their own conversations, for people who don't want to manage a YouTube channel, or just don't have any content or consistent content where they would always put something out there, that's kind of what this Randos United channel has morphed into, is for people on the Discord who are having conversations and want to get them out there into the world, even if it's just for people who are on the Discord to see. I've just provided this, it's just turned into a place for everybody to share the conversations that they're having if they want to. One other piece of this is, as I'm examining it, to a certain extent, I'm just copying what I see Paul doing, Paul Vanderklay. And I'm not so sure that it doesn't sound like his was all that intentional either. Like there may have been a baseline intent to accomplish a very limited task, and then it just continued to morph and grow and turn into different things, right? He has said before that he was just looking for more conversation partners, because in his local church context, as a pastor of a very small and what he calls dying church, he didn't really have a lot of people that he could have these conversations with, and he wanted to have conversations. And so, he transitioned into the YouTube world of just sharing thoughts that he was otherwise sharing in like a blog written format, but just turning them into, free flow, working out his thoughts by speaking them in monologue videos. And we who are familiar with Paul Vanderklay and his channel kind of know the rest of the story. We've sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally become a part of the story, right? And so it's just all unfolded from there. The creation of this channel, I've talked about this before, it didn't really even feel like much more of an intent than I just had a feeling that the people that I saw on Paul's channel, I felt like I want to have conversations with some of the people who have been on with Paul. And this was months before the Discord server that Joey and company set up existed. And I just felt like, well, I'd be interested in having these same kind of conversations with those people. And I'm not really sure where the motivation to actually share those out on the internet comes from. Some of the very first conversations that we all started having together, we who had met through Paul Vanderklay's channel, were not ones that we published, and were not ones that we recorded and posted. And as I'm talking this through, maybe part of the reason was some of the people who couldn't sync up their schedules to be a part of those conversations that otherwise would have wanted to be involved would then ask us, well, what did you guys talk about? How did the conversation go? I'd love to hear it. And so that was a little bit of the rationale for why we started recording them. And then we were just sending the files to one another. And then, you know, I guess it just naturally turned into, well, I wonder if there are other people out there who maybe would want to hear these or see these. And I'm sure there was a piece of it that, you know, there's probably some streak of narcissism, as harsh as that word might sound to some people. So I'll just focus it on myself. There's probably some part of me, maybe narcissism isn't the right way, but whatever it is in us that makes us want to be seen and known and to know, that motivates me a little bit whenever I'm involved in these conversations, to put them out there for other people to see. Because as much as sometimes we feel like we want to avoid criticism, we certainly dislike harsh criticism. We also very much enjoy, you know, the is it plaudits or plot? I don't even know if I'm using the right word, but for people to heap praise on us, or to tell us that they agree or that they like what we have to say. We certainly do enjoy that. I mean, social media and the feedback loops and the dopamine hits that come from likes and from approving comments. You know, social media testifies to how powerful drivers those things are for us as the beings or whatever we are as humans. So I'm not excluded from that. I'm sure that I, you know, on different levels, enjoy hearing or seeing what people have to say. But I also just love when people see these conversations and they say, hey, that made me think of this, and I'd like to talk about this, whether it's, you know, sending a note or spawning more conversations that we're able to have on the Discord server, or people reaching out and saying, you know, I'd like to share some of my ideas, or I'd like to talk through my story a little bit, because making myself known also leads to other people sharing themselves and figuring things out about themselves. Whenever I make myself known to other people and they reflect back what it is that they are seeing or are interpreting, it opens up new, I've used this phrase before, it opens up new vistas, both of ourselves and of the other person. It's like something new comes out of conversations in both the person that's being unveiled to us, but also what in us that person is unveiling that was previously unknown to ourselves. And so I don't know if I answered any of your questions, but those are just some of the thoughts that have bubbled up to my consciousness.
No, it was gorgeous. We no longer need an umbrella. The clouds have certainly parted. That was magnificent. And so a number of things came to mind. One, our congruence, because I too see in the work of dialogue, the dia, the through. I'm a sucker for words. I just am. The dia, logos. So what cuts through a word? What is a word for it to be cut through? What kind of material substance are we talking about? And so you get a John Vervaeke who doesn't want to talk about a particular piece of pottery that contains a particular set of psychotechnologies that can be practiced and participated with in the great arena of conscious awareness. He wants to talk about the set of all pottery. And kind of like a bull in a china shop, in my particular interpretation, he's all right with breaking these containers if it's in the service of getting us to a vessel that will take us where we need to go. And where that is and what that is up for debate, but I think that's what he's going after when he says there can be a religion that is not a religion. Now, the propositional assent or disagreement with that aside, the vista he opens in using those words in that order gives people pause, and they think, and then they go to their friends or they go to a complete stranger because their friends now become complete strangers when they start opening their mouth and like, wait a minute, a religion that is not a religion, that's heresy. Da-da-da-dum. Right? The wall is built up and the bull is identified as a bull that needs to be brought out of the china shop into a stable. And so things become segregated again. And that's where I put the whole tribal language, and then in its minutia, the identity politic foray, all that stuff that people just pour gasoline on day after day on Twitter, and really, like you said, the dopamine kick, little droplets of ecstasy that comes from stating your opinion poetically so that certain groups get charged. That is an interesting facet of the internet. But the main broad thing I wanted to bring out after you said what you said, because it went deeper than all of that for me, was the unveiling through dialogue. The through logos comes with an unveiling, and that is metaphorical in its description. So you could unveil by going to a monastery, to the Louvre in Europe, looking at paintings or icons, by going to the Grand Canyon, by pre-internet, because I mean, what is the internet? Going and seeing a mystery play, right? Before Shakespeare's time. Seeing a bunch of actors up there wearing personas, pretending to be allegorical figures from the Torah. Crazy stuff. But yet we recognized, before we passed judgment, something that unveiled in us. And I feel like with the internet, we're just doing, metaphorically speaking, mystery plays for strangers. Now, if someone were to write down what we're doing, I mean, it could pass for a book or a series. Now to C.S. Lewis. This is a man who had between his ears a library, a compendium of folk tales and myths and fairy tales. And he was rational, and he had friends that liked to dialogue about reason. And you get this marriage of the scientific empiricism, the way of talking, and these stories that just reveal all. And he makes things. He makes containers. Or maybe you don't see his books as containers. And I don't know if you're comfortable talking about the psychotechnologies or what you're comfortable talking about, but I would love to hear you riff and rhapsodize about C.S. Lewis, his relation to you. Because I've talked in other videos till I'm blue in the face about Kierkegaard and my existential experience with his existentialism. But that's old hat. I consider that my past, because I've talked through it and I'm bored. But I want to hear, I've never heard you, but maybe I just haven't found the video yet, talk through your relation to Lewis, or Lewis's relation to Jeff. Maybe that's too meta. Do whatever you want.
No, I think it's a good thing to talk about. Again, as I say, I'm very unfamiliar with my own intentions. I don't talk about this stuff a lot, and it's quite ironic, because I'm looking to start more conversations with more strangers, and the stakes go higher and higher as you move into the real life type conversations. So this is even a good training exercise for me. So I appreciate you bringing it up. If I'm going to focus on leading some type of the church that I'm at, is using the context of small group, it would be a good thing for me to be able to talk this through. You and I have had an interaction before on Discord where we talked briefly about Lewis and kind of along these lines, and so I'm hearkening back to that for a moment to see what I can remember there, because I'll articulate my thoughts and then I'll forget about them, and as long as they're documented somewhere, I'll treat them like, well, I can always reference back to this. One of my favorite quotes that I'm going to butcher is Albert Einstein says, what does he say? A short pencil is better than a long memory. And so I live by that. If it's written down someplace where I can go back and find it, and I felt like I articulated it very well, I'll just go reference that whenever anybody asks me. But that's a difficult task when you're asked to speak extemporaneously. So I'll try to draw it up in my memory banks. But one of the places that I think we connect on about Lewis is he opens up those vistas, right? You've used iconic vision before as a way of describing things, and Lewis for me is someone who takes me places that allows me to see things that I was unable to see before, or to see through things and see a much bigger and broader way of understanding, or of just awareness of what was there that was unseen before. So he is an unveiler for me. I'm trying to think. I have had a conversation on this channel before. It's somewhere in the backlog with Michael from the Discord, who has spoken with Paul Vanderklay several times, or at least twice, and certainly been on Karen Wong's channel.
I met Michael last week.
Oh, okay, good. Yeah. Michael is
go ahead.
awesome. And we talked about C.S. Lewis a bit in our conversation. The first time that I encountered Lewis, I actually had this, I just had this recollection brought to mind this past week. The first time that I encountered Lewis, I was attending a private Christian school in 6th grade. And my 6th grade teacher, and I mentioned this in my conversation to Michael, but it was my 6th grade teacher who had introduced me to C.S. Lewis, and I actually reminded her of that earlier this week in a post on Facebook, as she was reminiscing about something in that time of her life. And it was through the Chronicles of Narnia. I remember in that 6th grade class, there was an animated, I think CBS produced it, an animated version of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe from the late 70s. And this was several years later. We watched it on VHS in my 6th grade class. And so then I got a box set of the Chronicles of Narnia, but I never read through them. I think, I can't even recall if I actually read the first book. I remember people telling me some of the things that were going to happen in the series, and someone telling me that the last book in the series was not necessarily a retelling, but perhaps they said it was like the book of Revelation from the Bible. And so I was really excited about that, because I had been traumatized from certain interpretations of the book of Revelation in prior youth group experience in one particular church that I went to whenever I was younger, telling me about what the end times was going to be like, and the tribulation, and a very particular evangelical tradition and of the church that I went to. And I just remember being scared to death of some of the things that I was being told. But when it came to the Chronicles of Narnia, I wasn't fearful. I was a little bit older, and it was more of any type of a end times prophecy type thing into the world was just very, it stood out in my salience landscape, to use some Vervaekean language. And I have no experience with Vervaeke's work. I have not dug into it. I have not been watching any of the videos. I've only seen what Paul has shared and seen his conversations with John Vervaeke. But the end of the world, end times, not digging into like end times prophecy or anything like that was not all that exciting to me, but just anything that had to do with the end of all things has always been very interesting to me, or what's going to happen after this. And so I've always been, and I'm going all over the place with this, but I love realizing
I love it.
I've always been drawn to post-apocalyptic type stories. And then in the late 90s, when the original Matrix movie came out, it was like a combination. It was like a convergence of post-apocalyptic and what is reality. Because there's a whole simulation that's going on. The Matrix is a simulation that, brains are just in these, well, not actually jars. The whole humans are in jars or in vats, hooked up to this thing, and they're living in this illusion. And so, that was just very interesting to me. And let's see, when did so anyway, back to the Chronicles of Narnia for just a second. I was never a reader as a child. I never enjoyed reading. I remember there were these, whenever I was young, there was like our public library had a reading competition, like over the summer, and the kids who read the most books, I don't even remember what the reward was. But my brother and my mom would take us to the library, or maybe it was my aunt, I can't remember now, would take us to the library and bring us home with these little forms where we could track which books that we read, and then our parents would sign off that we actually read them. Mm-hmm. And I think I was just trying to, I guess I wanted to mark things off of my list just to show that I had done them. This was long before this Chronicles of Narnia. I fly all over the place with my timelines of stories, but I remember just wanting to mark, I wanted to show that I had accomplished something without doing any work to accomplish it. So I had a millennial mindset long before millennials were tarred and feathered with, being given this particular mindset as associated with their generation. So I didn't want to put in the work. I just wanted to get it done. And I remember trying to pass it by my mom one time to get her to sign it. And she's like, "There's no way you read these books. You haven't had enough time." I was like, "Oh man." So that was just to illustrate how much of an ass I was, I guess. Probably still am. But I remember I had the box set of the Chronicles of Narnia, and it was I call it the classic pictures, but they weren't the original illustrations. They were whichever ones came out in the 80s. And I remember seeing the covers of all the books and wanting to have access to the stories, but not having to go through the exercise of reading them to get to it. So I never read the Chronicles of Narnia as a child. It wasn't until I was a parent that I actually read through the entirety of the Chronicles of Narnia. And I was waiting for the last book, book 7, The Last Battle, because I really was still looking forward to what was going to be in that book. And I encountered probably the most significant part of The Last Battle while reading another book. And I read a blog post that I had written about this years ago in my second one-on-one conversation with Paul Vanderklay. And so I won't go into too much detail there, but there was a piece that was spoiled for me in the Last Battle book that just made me want to read it even more. And it's the Emmet or the Emma story of, the quote-unquote outsider that nobody would have expected to find in Aslan's new world, his new version of Narnia, which is, representation of heaven or new heaven and new earth after the end of all things. And so I was an adult when I found out that section was in the book, and I think I was in the midst of reading through the Chronicles of Narnia with my kids then, and I was just so looking forward to getting to the very end of the series so that I could really experience that section of the book in its full context. So I was kind of all over the place. I think probably the first Lewis book that I read with any seriousness, like really focusing, was when I was going through a difficult storm in my life. It was whenever I was having trouble in my first marriage that eventually led to divorce, I was looking for, I really don't know exactly what I was looking for, but I met with a guy who used to lead a small group that my ex-wife and I attended at the church that we went to at the time. It was like a newcomers type small group, and he had recommended Mere Christianity for anybody who was a new Christian by C.S. Lewis, and I'd never really heard of it before. All I knew Lewis for at that time was his Chronicles of Narnia stories, so I had no idea that he had written anything for, quote, adults, but the Narnia stories are for adults as well. You just have to be of a certain age. You have to have not really become a full adult, I suppose, or maybe so. I can't remember how he's got this clever way of talking about how true adults still are in touch with their childhood, where people who have lost their childhood have pretty much lost everything as adults. They don't want to be seen as childlike. They associate childlikeness with childishness, and so they want to put away those type things. Anyway, so I read Mere Christianity, and it was really helpful to me. It opened up a lot of ways of looking at things that I'd always seen in one way and thought was boring and had no life in it. I just thought they were really dead concepts. I was in the mode of the saying familiarity breeds contempt. I wasn't contempt of all the biblical stories or of Christian theology or anything like that growing up in church, but it just felt very threadbare, to steal a Paul Vanderklay term. But reading Lewis just revivified everything. It just brought concepts to life that I thought I already understood and thought had no bearing isn't the right word, but it certainly wasn't interesting or exciting to me. And Lewis helped to open those things up. Whenever I was going through the difficult part of my marriage, the small group leader who had initially introduced me to Mere Christianity, I met up with him a couple of years later just to talk through, how things weren't going well with my wife at the time and I. And I really started talking to him about some of the issues that I had with, my own faith and how I understood certain aspects of Christianity, particularly the doctrine of hell. And he recommended that I read the book by Lewis, The Problem of Pain, which I did. And to this day is still my favorite nonfiction or non-fantasy Lewis book. And the guy who used to be my small group leader pointed me to a chapter in that book on hell. And he said, well, Lewis talks about this a little bit. You might go read this chapter. So I did, and I read it, and it was a little over my head at the time, or I just wasn't understanding what was happening in that chapter. I mean, it was good, but it just didn't really help me. And so I decided to just read the book in its entirety. And that book just helped me so much more with dealing with the storm that I was working through. So that the thing that I was going at with intent was not even what I got out of it, was not what I intended. And maybe that's why I'm a little oblivious to my own intentions, is because I don't feel like they necessarily lead me to what I intended anyway. And so I operate quite a bit in the world without intent, and for good or for ill, that's what happens.
As Hamlet said, our actions are our own, or rather, he put it through the line of one of his stage characters to trap his uncle. Our actions are our own; their ends, none of ours.
That's right. That's right. You what's another saying that I've heard? Focus on doing the job as well as you can do it, and let the results speak for them, or not speak for themselves, but let the results take care of themselves.
Mm. But continue with your story. You're a delightful storyteller. I love the way in which you modulate time, because it crisscrosses with juxtapositions of image, not necessarily boring, linear, 12 inches in a foot, left to right, boring pace. You do it so well. Keep going. I'm seeing the theme building.
Well, I appreciate that. Sometimes my line of thought and pulling things together can be very annoying to some. So I appreciate that. So that was my first entrance into recognizing Lewis. I don't know, that he had a lot to say, and he had a lot of thoughts on things that I knew somewhere deep down inside were very important to me, but I just did not know how to access them. So he was giving me access to all of these ideas that I never knew were important to me until I started paying attention to what he had to say about them. And so what that did was it just opened the floodgate for me. I had to start getting my hands on any Lewis books that I could find in the bookstore. So somewhere along the line, I picked up The Great Divorce, which is my favorite work of fiction or of fantasy that Lewis has written. And it's such a short book too. Both of those books, The Problem of Pain is so short, but as I've said before, so potent. And The Great Divorce as well. A very short book, very quick read, but just so many concepts in there, so many interesting things of thinking about reality and considering what could be. And that's one of the things that I love about Lewis is he's opened me up to feeling safe to explore ideas of what could be without feeling like I'm doing something wrong or feeling like I'm going to cause harm to myself, my standing with the foundation of all being. Because
Well
I grew up in a church environment that, as my wife has so well pointed out and reminds me of many times. It was it's not even a denomination. It was more of a sect. I would say it's a hair shy of a cult, but certainly a sect of Christianity that saw the Southern Baptist denomination as liberal.
Hush now, what?
Yes. So I think from what I understand about John Vervaeke, he may have grown up in somewhat of a similar environment, but it's very interesting. I never felt harm, or harm is not the right word, but I never felt like overt. I don't know if judgment is the right word, but certainly not overt fear from the people there. There was certainly implicit fear of, the danger, the fear of falling into the hands of a living God. And I don't take those passages of scripture lightly at all. But it also Lewis made me feel safe, maybe because I saw someone like him who seemed to be very respected, as I mentioned in my last conversation with Joe, respected by seemingly, the major lanes, I think is the word I used, of Christendom, the Eastern Orthodox, the Roman Catholics, and the Protestants. Now, I know that you can find segments probably in all three of those who have a lot of problems with Lewis, but it just seems like in the main, a lot of people seem to respect him and his thought on Christianity. And So just seeing that and knowing that in the particular church context that I was in or familiar with, more of a traditional, non-denominational Christian evangelical, more of the right side of the theological spectrum. Right is in directionally, not as in correct. I want to clarify that for anybody that may have triggered. And some others listening might say, well, no, the right side of that aisle is correct. I'm like, okay, everybody to each their own. Do what you need to do with that. But being there, you know, a lot of the people in the tribe that I felt like I was in at the time seemed to think that Lewis was safe and was okay. And so that made me feel safe and okay for being able to really dig down and read some of the things that he was putting forward. And so in The Great Divorce in particular, well, I think in the intro, in one of the intros to one of Lewis's books, he talks about George MacDonald and how George MacDonald had such an impact on him, and how he was so much of an inspiration in his theological thought and in his development. Made me read a bit of George MacDonald and made me appreciate the reverence that Lewis had for MacDonald. And then to read The Great Divorce and read Lewis write MacDonald into that story. And I've got a few blog posts that I've written about this that I'll probably share at some point, either in a conversation with somebody, or I might just post a video where I, you know, read it and then maybe comment on it a little bit for the
or link
one
to this
person.
video.
Or a link to this video, who knows?
It's up to you.
For anybody who might be interested, we'll see. But it just, so MacDonald is to Lewis as Lewis is to Jeff. So Lewis never got to meet MacDonald. MacDonald died before Lewis was born. Lewis got to meet MacDonald's son. Did MacDonald have a son? Yeah. MacDonald had a son, but MacDonald's sons had no children. So the family tree, at least through George MacDonald, ended with his son. But he got to meet, did he get to, I'm probably getting this all mixed up. I know he got to read George MacDonald's son. I think his name is Greville MacDonald, which that's an interesting name, but that's an aside. Greville MacDonald, I think, wrote a biography on his father. And so, oh, that's right. Lewis didn't get to meet MacDonald's son. He got to meet someone who had met MacDonald's son or knew MacDonald's son. And that's the closest that he got. And so I'm going a long way to get to the point that I'm trying to make, which is my way.
But then we'll know it as if for the first time.
Yes. Now I am unveiling. I'm getting to the point, the big reveal. In The Great Divorce, I just think of how wonderful it is that Lewis, you get to see Lewis's imagination on display, and I can only imagine how wonderful and how much love was in Lewis's exercise of being able to write what a conversation between he and one of his heroes would actually be like. And that's what you get to see on full display in The Great Divorce. It's probably close to, I don't know, maybe a third, maybe a quarter of the book is spent with Lewis learning from MacDonald in fictional conversation. And this is a really fascinating way of, it links to me, it links to what Jordan Peterson has said about prayer. And Peterson essentially is alluding to having a conversation with God, with the place where we don't know where ideas come from, where you sit on the edge of your bed and you honestly and earnestly ask questions and you're willing to listen to the answers. And
And
the
at that
exercise,
moment, I want to bring in even more suspense for your listeners. Keep that, Jeff. Keep it for 1 second. Keep it. Keep it.
okay,
Karen from the Meaning Code can rush in at this moment because Karen is exploring with Michael. She read Maps of Meaning very closely. She read it, I believe, 3 times and has written a treatment on it, where she reveals her hermeneutical key as it's coming into being for unlocking his aesthetic regard for all the levels of being. Right? We like to think of the zoological, but what about the phenomenological, starry heavens above, the moral law within, to quote Immanuel Kant? Jordan B. Peterson is a modern 21st century Immanuel Kant who happens to be a clinical psychologist at the same time. But she's been reading this book, Maps of Meaning, and asking herself, all right, Aristotle's aim, my iconic eyes, those are my words. Things come into view and receive hewn edges, and they find their fractal place to hide as being passes. But what permits the items of knowledge to enter conscious awareness? And what is it that excludes, that debars all the rest? The combinatory explosion outside our conscious windowsill, so that we have this fly buzzing in our room. And then Emily Dickinson like, that we fixate on and try to participate in a kind of relationship with throughout our lives. What permits and what excludes? How and why? This is Karen's project and her ambition, and I'm falling in love with the adventure of it. And it is this thing that Plato was talking about way back in his book, where he thought the original impetus to philosophizing is wonder. The feeling of wonder. Period. Aside. Let's go back, Jeff. Taking the red bookmark out, continue telling your story.
Wow. Yeah, well, it's hard for me to come back to where I was going, because you made me think of so many things there now. But I'll pause. I'll hush those thoughts for a second. The Paul Vanderklay Consciousness Congress. I'll tell one side of the Congress, all right, settle down, and we'll go back. I really think the only point that I was getting to there is I just think it's a beautiful thing. It was a wonderful exercise, I think, to imagine what it was like for him to be able to write that, but then to see it play out on the pages and to see the conversation between the two. And it just has some wonderful moments that I won't get into here, but it's a treasure to me just to be able to see it. And I have thought about this a little bit, where I would like to be able to dialogue with Lewis, and one of the joys of just considering the idea of what that might be like was revealed to me when Mary Cohan suggested a series of videos where Eric Metaxas sits down with Walter Hooper, the biographer, the editor of so many different C.S. Lewis works, and he tells a story in this 3-part video series where he's being interviewed about how he first met Lewis. Lewis invited him to come visit Lewis in Lewis's later years, shortly before Lewis passed away. Come visit him in I can't remember which part of the UK it's in, but to visit him at his home in England. And Hooper talks about how he had been corresponding with Lewis, and Lewis, would correspond a great deal with anybody who would write to him. He would try to write them back with substance and address, what their questions were. he took that as a part of his duty, of being someone who was in the public eye, and to all of his readers, he felt like that was a part of his calling. And so he actually invited Walter Hooper to come visit him. And Walter Hooper just tells the story of how Lewis just made him feel like he was the most important person that was in the room, right? If I were sitting with Lewis, I would not feel like I was the most important person in the room, just thinking about it, right? But he says, no, Lewis would make you feel like you were the most important. And he even took him to an Inklings meeting. He said, well, you're not going home yet. You're going to come with me tonight. We're going to go and we're going to sit with the Inklings. And he said he would continue to draw Hooper into these conversations to say, well, what do you think about this, Walter? This is something that I think that you would have particular importance to bring into this conversation. Tell us what you think. And he would put the spotlight. He would talk about how Lewis would put the spotlight on him. And that just seems to me like that was just a joy to be able to hear that that's what it would be like to spend time talking to Lewis. Again, not for the narcissistic part, but just for him to have that ability to draw that out of people and to help people to unveil, right? To see things about yourself that maybe you didn't even realize, or to make you feel better about yourself than you did. It's a quality that it sounds like is common with Fred Rogers as well, for people, Mr. Rogers, who spent time with Mr. Rogers and sat down and talked to him. They would say, he made me feel like I was the only person on earth. He was just able to focus his attention on me and treat me like there was nothing else in the world that was important besides this person that he was talking to. And that seems to be a common quality, as I understood it, between him and Lewis. And, I'm not trying to deify the person. I certainly understand that everybody has their faults. But that quality in and of itself seems to be a quality that transcends these individuals. And it's a quality that I think if we could all reach, to try to reach toward and strive toward and grab, I think we would all start to embody the Logos. And if I could use some church language for a moment, all start to look more Christ-like and act more Christ-like. That a lot of the problems that we see in the world that are of our own making would start to evaporate in fast fashion. And so, I would like to be able to try to cultivate that in myself and be able to draw the light forth from and through other people, both to shine on me selfishly, but also reflect that light back to others. And so that's a little bit of what Lewis means to me. Lewis is a window to something bigger and brighter and transformative and transcendent. Not Lewis himself, but the windows that he's able to open, the things that he's able to help me see are things that I think would make the world better, but to bring it down to a localized level, to help make my relationship with my wife better, with my kids better, with my family better, my brother, my sister, my aunts and uncles, my friends, my neighbors, my community. This is for me the key to the equilibrated state that Peterson points to in Piaget. If it's right at the localized level, it will start to reverberate out and make things right at the global and the universal level.
Amen. I'm done. Jeff, you took my breath away. I mean it. That was I mean, what can one say after that conclusion? I have to go. I have to go. Thanks for I got some errands to run and a whole day's worth of words to meditate on. Thank you, Jeff.
Well,
C.S. Lewis.
thank you for taking the time, especially on your Sabbath. They're very important. We overlook our Sabbaths at our peril, and so we need to take advantage of the commandment that comes out of the Old Testament, is to take our Sabbaths and use them, because the Sabbath was created for us, to quote an old mystic named Jesus. The Sabbath was made for us, not us for the Sabbath. So we should take advantage of it. So I'll let you take advantage of it. I need to go as well. But I really appreciate the time, Matt. You are a very unique person. You have a unique way of seeing and talking about things, and it makes me take note. And I reflect a lot. Just a quick aside. I know you've got to go, but there was a conversation. I think it was the first conversation that you had with Cassidy, where you were talking about walking down the street and just observing the trees, and it was a different way of seeing that I don't think is common for a lot of people, and I envy being able to see that way too. So I look forward to just learning a lot more from you, and just seeing your interactions on the Discord or in other future conversations with people out there, and conversations with me. I've done a lot of talking on this one, so I look forward to hearing and learning more from you.
Thank you, Jeff. Bye.
Bye. Take care.
Take care. Next time.